The conservative climate of Cold War 1950s American society was slowly rocked by counterculture, Vietnam War opposition, and a series of ethnic, gender, and racial rights movements, first by the beginning of African American civil rights movement, then through a firestorm of multiple social revolutions. Within these tumultuous decades, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, politicized as Chicanos and Borucuas, drew from early developments of the World War II era to spark their own form of protest, the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. One of the least studied social movements of the 1960s, encompassed a broad cross-section of issues, from restoration of land grants to farmer worker rights to enhanced education to voting and political rights. The modern Chicano political movement, most scholars agree, began during the mid-1960s, a time coinciding with the Black Power movement.
This generation of Mexican Americans were singled out by people of both sides of the border, in whose views of Mexican Americans were not American, yet they were not Mexican either. In the 1960s, Chicano was accepted as a symbol of self-determination and ethnic pride. Within this movement, other movements blossomed, specifically the struggles of gender equality, access to higher education, immigrant rights, and a literary and artistic revolution which spoke to cultural rebirth and a rediscovery of mestizo/indigenous roots and self-definition. There were many struggles experienced by the community to ultimately achieve what justice and equality meant for them. These struggled to improve the lives of farm workers, the effort to end Jim Crow-style segregation and police repression, the land grant struggles, the struggle to improve educational opportunities, and the struggle for political representation and self-determination.
Among the most famous civil rights activities were the 1960 Los Angeles high school walkouts, also referred to as blowouts. During the spring of 1960, Chicano students at 4 East Los Angeles high schools staged massive walkouts, demanding better guidance counselors for college, Latino teachers, Mexican American history classes, and parental advisory boards. Although these walkouts elicited a negative response from the Anglo community, resulting in arrests and crackdowns, the city of Los Angeles eventually gave in to some of the demands, and parents formed their own Mexican American Educational Committee to monitor reforms.
Not subdued by the absence of a large presence in higher education, Mexican American public scholars debated the issue of the days in newspapers, opposed to lecture halls. An example is Clamor Público, published by Francisco P. Ramirez in Los Angeles in the 1950s, provided a forum for the discontented Mexican communities in the United States. It was not until after the 1960s, as a result of educational opportunity programs, the Chicanos/Chicanas steamed onto campuses in unpredicted numbers.
The Chicano movement was violent to an extent, but a leader of the movement, Cesar Chavez, would later elaborate on his tactics for nonviolence as the only weapon for mass mobilization.
Through truth and justice on our side, we're seeking them. We've adopted a method of nonviolence. We expect violence against us.
Best known for his efforts to gain better working conditions for thousands of workers in farms for low wages.
We have a right and an obligation and a commitment to see that justice be done, and that the workers have their own union, their own.
And under severe conditions, Cesar also insisted that Latino and Filipino strikers would work together, sharing the same picket lines, strike kitchens, and union halls.
With it, but we have a commitment to freeing those workers who are literally slaves under the growers and the teamsters.
He was willing to sacrifice his own life so the union would continue and that violence would not be used. A strong believer in the principles of nonviolence practiced by Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He used peaceful tactics such as fasts, boycotts, strikes, and pilgrimages to bring about justice for farm workers.
For more than 3 decades, Cesar led the first successful farm workers' union in American history, achieving dignity, respect, fair wages, medical coverage, pension benefits, and humane living conditions, as well as countless other rights and protections for hundreds of thousands of farm workers. Against previously insurmountable odds, he led successful strikes and boycotts that resulted in the first industry-wide labor contracts in the history of American agriculture with non-violent means.
Most of the organizations that appeared very prominently during the late 60s and early 70s.
Looking back, historians like Dr. Emilio Zamora have come into an agreement that the nonviolent effort created a sense of peoplehood for those Mexican descent, to make American principles applicable to the barrios of the United States, to empower Mexican Americans politically, and to do it both collectively and individually.
That and after that, That is one very important marker, the organizing efforts by farm workers to strike for improved conditions and boycotts.
However, there were targets and determined strategies placed as tactics in order to weaken militancy and political organizing from both sides of the movement that justify how the movement itself was violent in extent. Police surveillance was present during the times of protest, and they were constantly provoking to commit the violent acts, such as frequently displaying counterproductive behavior.
A leader of the Action for Land Rights in the Latino and indigenous communities in New Mexico, Tijarina's movement was a major inspiration and shows the world a large land theft that occurred in New Mexico. He preferred to be identified as Indo-Hispano and marched shoulder to shoulder with the Native and Black liberation struggles such as the Black Panther Party and American Indian movement. Him and his men were often armed as they fought acres of land that ruled Chicanos' claim that were stolen from hundreds of years since the American and Mexican War. Rudolph Corky Gonzalez was a poet, activist, and amateur boxer who created the Denver-based Crusade for Justice. In the 1960s, he worked with Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers of America and the SCLS Poor People's Campaign to develop the movement of social justice. Him and his family also founded Escuela Tlatelolco, which was an independent school for Chicanos and Native American youth in Denver. He wasn't involved in the movement until he wrote an epic poem, I Am Joaquin, about the story and struggles of Chicanos facing during this time. Young activists later recognized his work and quoted his poems during the marches all around, which inspired him to write more and more pieces of literature that was based on the movement. He realized that spreading his word across the people and doing it peacefully with no disruption caused the people to understand the struggles that the Chicanos had to go through.
Prior to the 1960s, the Chicano community lacked political influence, but that changed when the American Political Association worked to elect John F. Kennedy president in 1960. Establishing Latinos as a significant voting bloc, the Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund was created in 1960 with assistance of the NAACP and funding from the Ford Foundation. Similarly, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Education Fund was created in 1972 and centralized community activists, providing more resources and funds to hire lawyers and file lawsuits against schools and other institutions that were denying Latinos equitable education opportunities. Some key organizations also addressed discrimination in public and private institutions to contribute to the overall success of this movement. Notable student groups, including the United Mexican American Students and the Mexican American Youth Association, staged walkouts from schools in Denver and Los Angeles in 1968 to protest Eurocentric curriculums, high dropout rates among Chicano students, a ban on speaking Spanish, and related issues.
In a parallel move, organizations that had previously identified with only one Latino subgroup, such as the Puerto Rican Self-Defense Action Association, had changed their names and oriented to be more inclusive of all Latinos and also leverage collective action. The first post-World War II victory for Mexican Americans was a constitutional challenge to school segregation. With the support of an Acumus Curiae, brief for National Association of Colored People, Mendez versus Westminster School District was a class action suit filed by Fledicus Gonzalo Mendez against 4 California school districts. The plaintiff demanded to end the school segregation for more than 5,000 Mexican and Mexican American students in various school districts in Orange County.
The first piece of federal
particular
legislation that
significance
recognized the
was
needs of
Judge
limited
Paul
English
J.
speaking ability
McCormick,
students.
finding
Initially,
students' rights to equal
participation in
schooling and should
aid by
protect under
school
the Equal
districts was
Protection
voluntary,
Clause
but with the
of the
1974
14th
U.S.
Amendment.
Supreme Court case Law versus Nichols, however, the provision of education services for English language learners of any nationality or ethnic background was mandated. In Cisneros versus Corpus Christi Independent School District of 1970, the judge ruled that Mexican Americans were an identifiable ethnic minority group and could thus benefit from Brown versus Board Education school segregation cases. In a subsequent ruling, Keys versus School District No. 1, Denver, Colorado of 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that the Mexican Americans have the constitutional right to be recognized as a separate minority.
Today, several pop cultural influences were inherited from decades-old movement. Moreover, the burgeoning of Chicano art was also fueled and heightened political activism and energized cultural pride. The art representation of the Chicano movement was categorized in 2 levels. 1. Popular religious art as a strong influence of the Catholic Church. Some of these influences are seen today in home and roadside religion shrines and cemetery art and milagros. And 2. Popular secular art as a form of revolt, social political problems, and protest. Most of these artworks are represented in paintings, but also murals and traditions of Diego Rivera.
Why is the Chicano movement of the 60s so relevant today? The outcome of the civil rights movement among Puerto Ricans and Chicanos affected most areas of society, including higher education. One tangible result was the creation of Chicano and Puerto Rican studies and research centers in college campuses. Scholars organized to ensure that social science research on Latinos was included in traditional research agendas and that more Mexican, Puerto Rican, and other Spanish descent faculty were hired.
As a result, the Latino experience is now a legitimate field of study, and there are academic journals, courses, and university departments devoted to the research of Latino history and culture. Chicano activism in 1968 led to educational reforms. It also saw the birth of Mexican-American legal defense and educational funds, which formed the goal of protecting the civil rights of Hispanics. The 1968 blowouts in Los Angeles emulated in other southwestern countries and forced educational reforms.
Voces del tambor tocando, flautas que hablan con Dios.
The blowouts were not only a historic moment in U.S. history, but in the lives of these students. They became the change makers the South Castro asked for, those who would have the courage as he did to challenge and confront the status quo, and those who would deny educational and equal opportunities for Chicanos and other Latinos. These blowouts remind that social justice and democracy are not given to them. They have to fight for this, and that only through collective struggles can we achieve these goals.